Humans have had a long fascination with stories about the dead rising back from their graves and coming to haunt the living. So, why would we think that Dracula was our first vampire? Well, he wasn't. By the time Bram Stoker introduced Dracula to the world in 1897, stories about the dead rising from their graves and haunting the living have already been existing for centuries. And the best part? The vampire didn't just become mysterious, handsome aristocrat living in a castle. Before Dracula before Dracula had his fangs, cave, and an iconic Transylvanian castle, the vampire belonged to something much older and much inconsistent. The vampire belonged to the folklore. And that's important because these stories were just simply created to scare people. They were often attempts to explain things that people didn't have scientific explanation for. Someone died, and several people in the house have fallen sick. So the body was dug up again weeks after the burial, and it didn't look the way the people expected it. There was blood around the mouth, hair and nails have grown over time, and the corpse looks surprisingly well preserved. Today, we have an explanation for all of these things, but centuries ago, there was just one logical conclusion. The dead wasn't staying dead, the dead was coming back to life to feed on living and bringing death along with them. Hi, I'm Sohani, and today I want to talk about one of my most earliest fascinations from literature, the actual origin of vampires. The best part about vampires is that there isn't one single origin that this is the OG vampire. There are different versions about the dead getting back up, preying upon the living, spreading diseases, or simply refusing to stay where they belong. We can find versions of stories in ancient Greece, Eastern Europe, Slavic folklores, across the Balkans. Over time, these different traditions began to contribute pieces to the vampires we recognize today. So, before we got Dracula, Twilight, Anne Rice, and the incredibly attractive vampires thanks to modern pop culture, we need to go back to the beginning. Because the actual history of vampire doesn't start with literature. It starts with a very simple fear. What if the dead are not staying dead? So, if vampires existed before Dracula, what exactly did these look like? Well, there isn't a standard vampire. So let's go start with Lamia from ancient Greek mythology. Lamia was originally described as a beautiful woman, but her story took a very dark turn. According to the myth, she became a child killing monster after losing her own children. Over time, Lamia became to be associated with preying upon young people, particularly children, and later tradition began portraying her as a seductive creature who lured men to their deaths. Talk about feminine rage. Now, technically, Lamia isn't a vampire in a modern sense. She doesn't simply arise from the grave and drink blood like Dracula, but she has the several contributing characteristics that we closely associate with vampires. The beautiful but dangerous persona, a predator who feeds upon the living, and the connection between desire, death, and night. And the next folklore is something which brings us much closer to the vampires that we recognize today. The Slavic and the Balkan traditions of the Reverend. In these stories, if a person has died, and then that person is capable of returning to the world of living. And the scary part of these folklores is that the person hasn't transformed into completely different looking monster. It could be a neighbor you knew, a family member, or someone who has recently died, and people believed that individual is most likely to return. Perhaps someone who has died a bit more recent has died suddenly, someone who hasn't been properly buried, someone who has broken up some sort of social or religious rules. And once this person returned, they could torment their family, spread illness, or attack the living. And A bit more creepy, and particularly my favorite part of this vampiric tradition, is there are actual historic accounts from Eastern European communities opening up the graves of people who they believed are dead but have arisen from their grave. If the body looked unusually well prepared or there seemed to be blood around the mouth, people interpreted these signs as the corpse has been living and has been feeding. So, of course, now we know that these are the classic signs of decomposition. The skin is one of the last organs to show the signs. And but at that time, the people didn't knew this and they came to this conclusion. But at that time, people didn't knew that, and that is basically the origin of the vampiric folklore. The vampire wasn't originally a glamorous supernatural creature. It was the dead who was coming back and bringing death along with it. And people genuinely believed that the dead was coming back, and they asked the question, what are we supposed to do now? And the answer came in the form of vampire hunting. The In the actual European folkloric tradition, vampire hunting was often a very practical and extremely grim community activity. If a village has experienced a series of unexplained deaths, illnesses, people believe that someone who was very recently buried has returned. The grave could have been opened, and if the body didn't look like what they expected it, though it was considered signs of vampirism. And according to records and historic evidences, each place had its own set of traditions to what to do to deal with this. The body could be burnt, the body could be cut up, a wooden stake could be passed through it, and these traditions varied from places to places. And at a time, there was one point in history where it spread so much that even the church had to step in and had to have a formal investigation done into these local traditions and debunk them. And so, for a moment, the vampire stopped being just a monster in a folklore. It became a question that people genuinely needed investigating. And honestly, it is one of the most fascinating and the most interesting part of the vampire mythology. We tend to think of folklores as something which people just believed in, but sometimes folklores actually influence what people did, including what they did to the dead. Practices like burying people with garlic and piercing the heart before burial became common across Europe. And that brings us to one of the strangest part of vampire history. How a fear of undead eventually became something that governments, doctors, scholars started taking seriously. So we have the folklore, and we have the vampire hunting, and we have people genuinely believing that the dead could come back. And at some point, vampire had to jump from folklore to fiction. And the best part about the vampiric story jumping from fiction to literature is that the literature didn't just copy vampires' appearance from the Eastern European folklore, it completely reinvented what the vampire could look like. And the stories related with vampires started to become increasingly popular with the gothic and romantic literature. And one of the most famous literary vampires wasn't a terrifying corpse crawling out of a grave, it was a handsome aristocrat. In 1819, John Polidori published The Vampyre, featuring Lord Ruthven, a mysterious, wealthy, charismatic man who moves through the fashionable society while secretly preying upon others. Sounds familiar? That's because Polidori basically created the blueprint for the sexy vampire, and there's also another interesting story behind it. Polidori had been Lord Byron's physician, and the Vampyre emerged from one of his famous ghost story competition held at Villa Dottani in 1816, the same gathering from where Mary Shelley got her inspiration for Frankenstein. And suddenly, the vampire wasn't just some disgusting creature hiding in a graveyard. He could be charming, he could be cultured, wealthy, seductive, and something that completely changed mythology. A few decades later, Sheridan took the idea further with Carmilla in 1872. At this time, the vampire was a woman. Carmilla was beautiful, mysterious, intimate, and deeply unsettling. The story plays with the idea of female sexuality, desire, secrecy, and the fear of something entering your private world slowly and taking control of it. And then, of course, we get to 1897. Bram Stoker publishes Dracula, and suddenly the vampire becomes one of the most recognizable monsters in Western literature. Count Dracula brings together so many different elements that were developing separately: the Eastern European vampire, an aristocratic predator, a supernatural seducer, the fear of foreigners, blood, sexuality, disease, death, and the gothic fascination with crossing boundaries that you are absolutely not allowed to cross. But the important thing when we read Dracula is that didn't invent the vampire. He was a result of centuries worth of folklore, superstition, gothic fiction, and cultural anxieties brought together into one character. And once Dracula became popular, it was impossible to kill him. It moved from books to theater, from theater to cinema, from cinema to television, and eventually everything from Interview with the Vampire to Twilight. But underneath all of these different versions, it all started with a common fear. A death may not be as final as it seems. And with that, we enter the 20th century, where the vampire really starts to evolve. Because after Dracula, writers had already established guidelines. The vampire, which could be mysterious, seductive, aristocratic, monster, and a hero. And the 20th century started asking different questions. What if the vampire wasn't just terrifying? What if it was tragic? The early 20th century cinema played a huge role with it. In 1922, Nosferatu gave us one of the most horrifying versions of vampire on screen. Count Orlok isn't charming, he isn't attractive, he barely looks human. He is basically the walking embodiment of death, and that is important because cinema gave vampires something literature quite couldn't give it yet: a face, a body. And then gave Dracula film in 1931. And suddenly the vampire became elegant again. Louis Gosse's performance helped establish the image that would dominate popular culture for decades. The pale, sophisticated man in formal clothing speaking softly while being absolutely terrifying underneath. But as the century progressed, writers became increasingly fascinated with the inner life of the vampire, and that's where Anne Rice comes in. In 1976, she publishes Interviews with a Vampire, and this completely changed the conversation surrounding him. Because Lewis isn't simply a monster. He is miserable, he is conflicted, he's questioning what he has become, and he has to live for centuries watching everyone he loves grow old and die while he is being cursed to remain the same. And suddenly, immortality, which used to sound like an ultimate supernatural power, starts to look like a curse. And suddenly, vampires aren't simply good or evil. They are people who just happen to be monster, and that became one of the defining features of the modern vampire. By the late 20th century, the vampire became almost like a blank canvas. You can use it to talk about sexuality, forbidden desire, disease, addiction, loneliness, class, power, or the fear of aging and death. And then in 21st century, the vampire goes from being a creature hiding in the darkness to a creature that millions of people suddenly want to read. And that might be the biggest transformation in vampire history. And there's a slight strange connection sort of a thing which I think is worth making right about now. Dorian Gray is the picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde is quite similar to vampire. They don't have anything in common. Dorian Gray is not a vampire. He is not drinking blood. He is not rising from the grave. And unfortunately for him, there is no garlic involved. But thematically, it's remarkably close. I was thinking about what the vampire represents at its core. It is the desire to escape aging and death. And that is exactly what Dorian Gray gets. Dorian gets looks at his portrait and realizes that the painting will grow old while he will remain young, and essentially he gets the fantasy that vampires have represented for centuries. The body is refusing to age. He gets to remain beautiful while everyone around him grows older. But Oscar Wilde takes that fantasy and asks, what if eternal youth isn't a blessing at all? And that's where Dorian Gray becomes so interesting alongside the vampire. The vampire escapes aging by becoming something other than human. But Dorian Gray remains physically human, and his portrait is the one who takes the consequences of his life. His face stays young, his body stays beautiful, but his corruption is being recorded elsewhere. And just like the vampire, Dorian Gray is trapped in a strange relationship with time. He can watch other people age, he can watch other people die, but he has to continue living. He can't really escape the consequences of being immortal. And another thing that made vampires quite terrifying was that they represented a desire that we aren't supposed to have, a desire to stay young forever, to remain beautiful forever, to escape the natural process of aging. And Dorian Gray gets exactly what he wants. And Oscar Wilde basically says, be careful what you wish for, because maybe the real horror isn't growing old. The real horror is never being allowed to. And that is actually one of the reasons why vampire has become such a powerful figure in literature. Now, whether Dorian Gray knew about vampires is is a completely different topic. But I think these two are quite similar when they first appear. Underneath all the blood and supernatural horror there is this very human fear, the fear of time passing and the desperate desire to stop it. Dorian Gray isn't a vampire, but he and the vampire are both fantasies born from the same impossible wish to defeat death without having to pay the price. What exactly is a vampire? There is no one answer. The vampire began as a creature of the folklore, a way of explaining death, disease, and a terrifying possibility that the dead might return someday. Literature transformed it and it became this aristocratic fantasy, the seductive monster of Carmilla, the terrifying Count Dracula, and the tragic immortal of Anne Rice's novel, and eventually the romantic supernatural figure that we see in pop culture. The every version tell us that something about the people who created it. The vampire changes because our fear change. When people feared disease and unexplained death, the vampire was a creature that spread it. When Victorian society was fascinated and terrified with sexuality and transgression, the vampire became seductive. When immortality became less of a fantasy and more of an existential question, the vampire became lonely and tragic. When popular culture started to romanticize the monster, well, suddenly vampires start having cheekbones, love interests, and a very dedicated fandom. And beneath all of those transformations, the oldest idea is still there. The vampire is someone or something that crosses the boundary between life and death. And perhaps that's why we never really got tired of them. Because the vampire isn't just a monster who drinks blood, it is the monster that asks one of the most oldest and one of the most uncomfortable questions to us. What if death isn't the end? And as long as we are fascinated with death, immortality, desire, and the possibility of unknown, I don't think we are ever going to stop telling stories about vampires. That's all I have